Today, Dan Garber is with us, a graduate of Carnegie Mellon, a local architect from the firm, also is co-chair of the Citizens Advisory Committee, which is responsible for making recommendations with regard to the Palo Alto plan. He has all sorts of honors and had previous experience practicing in Chicago, so I'm going to ask him about Frank Lloyd Wright. So let's get started, Dan, and we're going to talk first about, you don't have to get up, talk first about Burge Clark, who Dan has made, I wouldn't say, what should I say, study, but his interest. So how is Burge Clark significant to us at Palo Alto?
First, thank you. Fun to be here. Many honors, but none more honorable than this. Actually, have any of you lived in the Burge Clark house? Yeah, one, I think I've mentioned before.
You know all the Clarks from Evermore? Yes.
Oh, have you? Oh, that's exciting. I've only met the sons. I never knew Burge Clark. So maybe before I talk about what his impact is, maybe I will tell you what his impact was on me, even though I never met him. Coming from Chicago, I didn't know who Burge Clark was. Also, coming from Chicago, California is a fairly strange place. I mean, they actually use like this material called stucco on the side of houses, as opposed to wood. And they worked in a style that we are very unfamiliar with in the Midwest, which was the Spanish colonial, and trying to understand why that was so prevalent out here. I first was, because when we moved, many people said, oh, you're an architect, you must know about Burge Clark, and led me to the film that you can find in the public library, where he was being interviewed by Lisa Van Dusen and
a lot of us can't hear.
Oh, you can't hear?
No.
Yeah, talking here, it was film.
I'll hold it up to my mouth. That better?
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Much better? Should I repeat everything I just said?
No.
Okay. So I watched that film, and I was amazed by a variety of different things about Mr. Clark. One, that he designed in so many different styles. Unlike Frank Lloyd Wright, and I grew up in Evansville, Illinois, where there are a number of Frank Lloyd Wright houses. In fact, the house that I grew up in the second story, when I would look out one of my windows, I'd look into my neighboring house, which is designed by one of Frank Lloyd Wright's acolytes, Walter Griffin. So there's this beautiful brickwork and these beautiful windows, and I grew up looking at that. And it's an image and impression that I have kept with me ever since. So I was very interested in Frank Lloyd Wright. But Mr. Clark was a much different sort of character.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. And among the things that were different is that he designed in a variety of different styles. Tudor, Queen Anne, Spanish colonial. I'm trying to think if he ever did a Craftsman. I don't know of a Craftsman. Anybody know of a Craftsman that he did? I don't think so. In any case, so there was a question there. I was used to the Frank Lloyd Wright model of architects, where architects all designed pretty much in the same style. And that if you didn't do that, you were sort of looked down upon as you were doing something less than good as a result of that. But here was this gentleman who designed in a variety of different styles and had a remarkably long practice, 1922 through the 70s, into the 80s a little bit. And it was a practice where he produced quite a number of buildings. Some people have said close to 400. I've only been able to count a little over 200. Even 200 is a lot. And the longevity of his firm spoke to a couple of different things for me. That one, he was clearly very focused on his community and was very focused on what people asked him to do. And I think that was important for me to recognize that there was a connection between that and his styles. As a general preference, you can see a change in the way that this style that he chose to design in over that period of time. When he gets up to the 40s and 50s, he starts designing more contemporary styles. Prior to that, he is using, many more of his projects are in the Spanish colonial styles and related sort of stucco finished styles. So he had a commitment, in my mind, to service over product. Frank Lloyd Wright, the reason that somebody went to a Frank Lloyd Wright is because they kind of knew what they were going to get. They also knew that they would have to deal with a significant personality. I don't think that was the case for Birch Clark in either case. My sense of him and talking to people that knew him, and maybe Gigi, you can tell me otherwise, was that he was a very kind man, someone that listened, someone that was interested in finding ways to please you. That was not Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright, as we all know, was much more combative, much more interested in setting himself apart, enjoyed being the incomparable. But that was, for me, always a struggle as a role model. And I realized that for me, even though he had passed away before I had ever met him, Birch Clark was, I think for me, a much better role model for what an architect could be and potentially should be. He didn't wear a cape. He was less interested in publicity. It wasn't important, as it was for Frank Lloyd Wright, to be on the cover of a magazine. And importantly, he had a life. He had a family. He was active in the community. And here is a key talisman for him. He was able to retire gracefully. Frank Lloyd Wright wasn't able to do that. So, for me, he became a role model, and that was why he was so impactful to me. Relative to the community, I think what he is revered for, and I think we all think of him as doing for us, is creating the image, the sort of base image for what Palo Alto is. Now, Palo Alto is many things, but the history that this community has with the Spanish colonial styles, as well as the emerging modern ones that he was working on later in his career, really creates the backbone of what our community is. And it is something that many other communities wish they had. I'm going to bridge a couple of topics here, Tom, so forgive me. If you compare Palo Alto, for instance, to Berkeley, Berkeley had been around for a lot longer. First of all, it's a larger community, but it is also a more mature community in terms of the work that it generated and the age of its housing. So it often has significantly better examples of sort of precise styles. But it had the benefit of a lot more continuity at a time when the country was, shall we say, less complex. There were less forces acting upon it. And there's greater opportunities for those with money to have larger influences over it. With the exception of Stanford and Eichler, Palo Alto never had some of those benefits that Berkeley did to sort of create a dominant style or a dominant identity. But relative to other new communities, Burlingame, Menlo Park, Mountain View, the Peninsula communities, Palo Alto was unique in that it had a much more visual identity than those other communities have had. So.
And did Birch Clark contribute to that? How is his impact architecturally felt, seen, witnessed?
Yeah, so I think Birch Clark had sort of two modes. He did single-family homes, which are often very beautiful, but frankly, some of them were very modest. which is another really lovely characteristic about him. He was able to scale up for those that could afford it. But he didn't discriminate against those that couldn't afford those fancy houses, which I think is a wonderful thing. Frank Lloyd Wright did some modest houses, but they were usually sort of mission-driven, not always easy to live in. Interestingly, with Burge Clark, even though his style changed, his floor plans really did. He always was able to create very flexible floor plans that were easy to live in through a family's lifetime, which is not something that, frankly, much developer housing allows you to do. But the other motive of Burge Clark was they did a number of civic buildings, or buildings that weren't necessarily owned by the city, but had civic presence, of which we're in one today, as well as the President's Hotel that is on University Avenue, and the work that he contributed to on Ramona. And the post office, of course, and then the other buildings they did on Hamilton as well. But all of those have a consistency and a smaller scale that really focuses on the street and the view of the street. Now, interestingly, he could not build some of those things today for a variety of reasons. You know, some of them are taller than are allowed today. Also, the energy requirements that the state and city require would require significant changes to those buildings, as well as safety, life safety, and a variety of other things. So they were of a certain time, but those buildings, and in particular, I'd say the Lucy Stern Center, were really paradigms for how the community saw itself. Small, intimate, not exactly casual, but there is an ease and a connection to the outside, to the California climate, which is, as I don't know about all of you, but most of my friends are all immigrants here, and part of the reason that we enjoy it is because we've come from other places which are less easy to live in. Another bridge, if you'll allow me, Tom. There's an interesting bridge back to the medical center at Burge Clark. Some of you probably know that as famous as Burge Clark is, I think his sister deserves more fame, right, as being one of the founders of PAM and being one of the first pediatricians in the country. She broke more boundaries than Burge Clark ever did, and in many ways, it can be argued was had a more powerful impact on the community. Not environmentally, but certainly societal, within our society, within the community, the impact of the medical center.
So there are even buildings named after her.
Yes, and a park.
We were talking earlier about architecture practice today, practices, styles, but more practices, and architects who practiced earlier. Has the practice improved or not? Are you guys currently practicing better architects than those who were practicing 30 years ago?
Yes. No. Boy, that would be hard to answer in one word. The world is different. So many things are different. So what's different? Let's see. The regulatory is dramatically different. Once the 60s occurred and the various environmental acts were created, many of which were originated with work that was going on in California, with the exception of Rachel Carson in '57 when she produced Silent Spring. There are a number of motivations or influencers in the country, but the heritage of the regulatory environment that we live in now, I believe, really started in California with John Muir and the interest in preserving the environment and the series of regulations that occurred around that has multiplied into the world that we live in today.
especially in Palo Alto?
So Palo Alto likes to think of it as itself as very unique. It has even higher standards than its surrounding communities in a variety of different ways. So the regulatory environment is one that has changed dramatically. The concern around energy has changed dramatically since the 70s. When Birch Clark was practicing, the issues of energy were really about how we keep cool without having any mechanical means to do that. So you have stucco. You also will probably note if you go through his buildings that most of his houses have masses which are very narrow, which allow for cross breezes to occur. The sort of ratio between window to wall is often higher than you'd find in other countries, both for lead and light, but also for lead and air. This is obviously before air conditioning. Today, that is a much more complex exercise. In order to submit a house or a building for permit, you have to prove that it's going to be energy efficient. And California is unique in that it's very difficult to build a commercial building that isn't at a very high criteria compared to the rest of the country, although in probably the next 10 years, the rest of the country will catch up to California in its regulations. So energy, regulatory, here's a great one, population. Palo Alto, I'm forgetting exactly what the numbers were, but it's in the 60s. It first had a huge burgeon in population growth after World War II, when all the GIs came back, which had a huge impact on Stanford, which we can talk about later if we want. But then through the 60s, the population grew dramatically. So issues of density, privacy, traffic, parking, those were relatively non-existent, or when they existed, they were sort of easily ameliorated. Today, you cannot do anything without having to consider those as factors. And that will only get worse. So maybe those are some of the things that differentiate that.
Let's focus more on Palo Alto. What about the 50-foot maximum height limit? Is that going to be enforced? Are there exceptions to it? What do you see the future of that?
So this is a very controversial topic in the city. And it is one of the many issues that not just Palo Alto, but the peninsula, the Bay Area, is struggling with to address the forecast increased population as well as job growth over the next 15 years or so, 15, 25 years. Basically, the Bay Area in that time frame will grow, it's forecast to grow something like 2 million more people than it has today, which means that there will be something like 31% more houses and something like 37% more jobs here. So as much as we would like to think that it's just a Palo Alto topic, it is a regional topic. I believe in the last 10 years, I could be wrong about this, but I believe that there are now more people living in cities than there are in rural areas in the world. And all of the cities around the world are going to become significantly more dense. There's no way to outrun that short of creating fences, gates to communities, and the rest of that. Even if Palo Alto were to stop growing altogether, we'd be inundated by all the cars and traffic from all of our neighbors on either side of us. So obviously, it's often pointed out, if we have no more land, which Palo Alto has no more land, the only way to go is up if anyone wants to allow that. That's not going to change. The 50-foot height limit is not going to change anytime soon. That has been sacrosanct for a couple of decades now. A lot of debate around it. There's a lot of conversation at the city council, and the city council actually just this Monday were reviewing the land use and transportation element. Well, this was debated again. And there's beginning to be some softening on the 50-foot height limit around nodes of transportation. So at the train stations, it's really the specific the specific locations that are under discussion. But in general, I don't see that changing. Over the next 25 years, it will likely change.
Well, that leads us directly into the next issue. Berkeley and Seattle, among others, believe we're going to solve their housing crisis by permitting auxiliary dwelling units, ADU. And that has been presented here in Palo Alto. It's subject to quite a bit of comment. What would your comment be on that?
Seattle and Portland, et cetera, is also Jerry Brown, who created and passed a statewide requirement that all communities have to accept ADUs. So Palo Alto to...
Tell us what that is.
ADUs is the accessory dwelling units.
Which means
the ability to do one of two things, which is to create a separate standalone small house, cottage on your property, or to add on a rentable unit to your house that's attached to your house. One of those two things. So when that law was passed just this year, I think, or late last year, I forget exactly when, every community is required to create the opportunity for that to happen in their community. They can condition it to some degrees, but they cannot eliminate it. So I was actually, and this was just debated at the council, there was a second reading. Every time a ordinance goes through, is approved by the council, it then goes through staff for refinement and incorporation of the council's comment, and it comes back for a second reading. And that occurred a couple weeks ago on the 17th of April. And there are some additional revisions to that, to the law that Palo Alto is adopting were made, and it'll come back for a third reading in about 2 weeks, 3 weeks or so. So it is a bit of a moving target. I don't know exactly where it's going to land. But so some of the conditions that the city is looking at putting on that is that there needs to be minimum lot size. So a lot that's less than 5,000 square feet, you can't do it. There are some conditions where you could do a two-story accessory dwelling unit, not a one-story, but those have to be on larger lots. In the estate zone, there's various zones in the city that regulate how big and what type of thing you can build. And some of the larger lots in the city are in the estate zone, so they would allow a two-story. But in general, they have to, the ADUs, accessory dwelling units, have to obey, for the most part, most of the requirements that a regular house does. If it's standalone, it has to be inside all the setbacks. There's some exceptions to that. I apologize for that. I don't know what those are. There's typically single stories. And there may be some special conditions in the Highclere neighborhood that was discussed as something that council wanted staff to look at. So yes, and the council also wanted to make sure that the doors were not opening out into the side yard, et cetera, that were facing, if I'm recalling correctly, they had to face the same direction that the main house door had to face.
But only one front door,
That's right.
not two. They can't have two units, in other words.
That's right, yeah. Yes.
We'll go back to Eichler in a minute.
Actually, we have one question back there.
Oh.
Sorry, go
I'm
ahead.
concerned about parking. We live on a
Parking.
cul-de-sac, and I understand that there are no parking, off-street parking requirements for these additions.
There are no, as I understand, there are no on-site parking
Right,
requirements.
so they can just park on the street.
Yeah, and I believe, again, there's still a lot of movement in this, and I frankly don't know where it landed after the last conversation. I believe some of that is a requirement of the state, that there not be a limitation. And I believe the state law actually demands that. I'm not sure of that, though. I would have to check.
Some claim that this is turning the R1 neighborhoods into R2 neighborhoods.
The answer is kind of. An R2 neighborhood allows you to do, frankly, two houses of size. The ADUs, the accessory dwelling units, if they're detached, can only be 900 feet. So they can't be anywhere near as large, and they typically are only one story. And in R2, you could do a two-story house, and they can be significantly larger.
Is there going to be any regulation by this city with regard to Airbnbs, and particularly in these ADUs?
My bet is yes, absolutely. That is still an active topic at the council. I think some of you probably are aware that San Francisco has been working through a series of restrictions for Airbnbs. I think there's a lot of consensus around not allowing long-term rentals, quote unquote, to occur. So I would expect those to become codified. A short term is defined as
You mean, no, in short term rentals?
no, to allow short-term rentals.
No, the Airbnb is for short term. They want people, they don't want people coming and going all the time like a hotel. Isn't that right?
You're right, and I guess I'm remembering. I was at one of the council meetings. I don't think it was the last one that was on the ADUs where they were talking, where the conversation was around not allowing long term. So you're right. I do not know the answer to that.
So let's move on to another issue in town, and that is the definition of a nightclub. What is a nightclub? And what are the ordinances that are affected by that definition? What's going on with IDs?
I'll tell you as best as I know. So let me back up for a moment. Although it may seem like an obvious thing to say, I wasn't an architect. I was a developer. He was somebody that was buying land to make money from. Although many people credited him with creating a new type of housing that in some ways issued in a sort of modern style, a new way of living. Frankly, to me personally, he was more important for another reason, and that is he was the first realtor at scale that allowed anyone but white males to purchase property. He ended up dropping out of the brokerage association because they told him he needed to stop selling to blacks and Jews. He said, sorry, don't need to be a part of you. And frankly, to that, he is more important to me as a role model than hiring all these different architects to build the way that he wanted to. He was frankly looking for ways to build inexpensively. The Eichlers were not really designed to last more than 15 or 20 years. We've gotten, I don't know how many calls from people that have been living for 60 years, and they're living with molten walls and leaky ceilings because they're flat roofs, it didn't drain right,
Radiant heat not working.
Radiant heat, which was built with galvanized tubing, which rusted away. At any rate, people still love them despite all of that. And when you want to spend quite a bit of money, you can restore them and get them to actually eat something that you'd want to live in for another 60 years. Regardless, Palo Alto and a couple of other communities on the peninsula have large tracts of these homes, and they create a certain context. Some of these neighborhoods have historic categorizations which limit the amount of improvement you can do to these. And Palo Alto, I think, has taken a special interest in trying to find ways to sustain that context with these single-story, very glassy sorts of little things. And has it has had limited success in the past trying to create specific zoning ordinances which accomplish that, and is now working on a series of guidelines that would give the city discretion for essentially incenting people to improve, develop, and if they're building new in those neighborhoods, how to do that. So you could think of that as a workaround from not having or fail to create codification around that in the past.
Which leads to another situation, and that is of new modern houses, just a second, modern houses, a lot of wood and a lot of glass, located on a street with all other traditional houses, like the one on Martin that I mentioned a few months before.
Yeah, right. So let's back up for a moment. With the possible exception of the Eichler neighborhoods, the number of housing styles in Palo Alto is huge. You have Queen Anne, you have arts and crafts, you have craftsmen, you have Spanish colonial, you have mission revival, you have, there are dozens of them. There's modern, streamlined modern, and frankly mid-century modern sort of thing. As an interesting take on this, there is a very famous architect from California, William Wooster. Have you heard that name before? Wooster. So William, Mr. Wooster, was born, I believe, in Fresno, and was educated on the East Coast, MIT. Yes, in MIT, where he ended up staying to teach and ended up becoming the head of the Department of Architecture there before he was moved back to California to become the head of the Department of Architecture at Berkeley. This is really the 50s, if I'm remembering correctly. And he did a very unusual thing at that time, which was he combined their environmental studies program with the architecture program, which was only about 40 years ahead of its time. But the reason I speak about him, he was immensely successful. He probably built over 3,000 buildings around the country. But he is, I suspect, one of the reasons why we have this style of house called ranch houses. And he was looking in the 20s and 30s, how to build inexpensively but cleanly in a more modern sort of way, what we would think is modern and contemporary now. And that style, which he began to develop, and in particular one house they did for a publishing company, for a man that owned a publishing company whose grandson is still involved to get a house outside of Santa Cruz, near Tempo. It was a very, very famous house, extremely influential, reproduced in magazines in the 20s, late 20s. And everybody started doing houses like that. And they eventually became called the California Ranch. But when they first entered, and Palo Alto has, I forget, 15 or 20 of them, different ways, some of them would be torn down. But when those first came in the neighborhood, everyone thought they were horrible. Laying awful things with big glass. These things preceded Eichler's and was, some have credited it as inspiring Eichler as to what a modern house should be. One more time before I actually answer the question. I was just telling Tom I was in Orlando last week because I'm on the national committee that awards the 25-year award for a building that has withstood the test of time. And this year, the award went to the pyramid that's at the Louvre in France. That was done by an American architect who was an immigrant here, I.M. Pei. And when that went in, actually 27 years ago, people hated it. Absolutely hated it. Ugly, disrespectful, blah, 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 blah. It was unbelievable. Here's the thing, though. It is now the number one most beloved building in all of France. It has surpassed the Eiffel Tower as being the icon. What people don't know is that that little pyramid is perhaps, 8% of what that building really is, because that project was really carving out 2 stories below to create all the back of the house space and allow circulation to connect all the buildings that we now know of as the Louvre. And it's a very interesting story. I won't get into it. But in any case, hated, loved. So in that context, the new buildings, I will admit I have some problems with. From time to time, there are some very beautiful ones. In general, I believe that more contemporary or perhaps aggressively contemporary buildings need more space around them and not, they have a harder time fitting into a contextual neighborhood. Our office, we do contemporary buildings. When we do them, they tend to be Woodside or Portola or up the hill where they can be, where there's woods around them and there's sort of room to breathe, so they're not competing against these more traditional contexts. So part of my response is that there really isn't a traditional house in Palo Alto because there are so many different kinds. My other comment is at least the best ones, the best contemporary ones, over time will fit into the neighborhood just fine. So.
How about that aircraft carrier that's on Seal and Waverly or thereabouts?
Where the container has been placed on top of the walls there at a slightly different angle.
I hope that wasn't your.
No, it wasn't. Let's say that it was an interesting experiment.
The trouble is it lasts.
All things last. But, Frank Lloyd Wright had a great saying. He said, with architecture, or he was comparing himself to a doctor. Not a surprise for Mr. Wright. He said, surgeons and doctors can vary their mistakes, but architects can only plant ivy.
You had a question, sir.
Dan could return to Eichler and simply as an architect summarize the architectural guidelines that are expressed as a list or something like that.
I'm not sure I can do it justice here. Interestingly, the question was, what are the stylistic components of an Eichler? Yes. And the one thing I'll mention is that the city is actually pulling together these guidelines, that exact list that you're looking for now. Did you participate in some of the workshop that was 3 weeks ago? I haven't participated in it at all, so I don't really know what was happening. But yeah, so they, when I think about them, the parts of them that string together, because there are a variety of different types of styles, but they tend to be more compact. They're obviously single story. The centers are often open, and the entryways to them is often in a very sort of blended indoor-outdoor. They're often covered, but they have this very indoor-outdoor quality where whether you're in or out is very ambiguous. And that's part of what makes them so lovely. The other thing is that they tend to present a very opaque presence on the street. So they make a very clear definition between sort of what's public and what you're allowed to see as somebody walking through the neighborhood. And then they open up to the back, and that's where all the glass is. They tend to not be very sensitive to, frankly, where the sun comes from. So it's very used often where you end up with a large piece of glass, on the southern-facing side, which makes heating and cooling the houses very difficult. The other thing is that the structure on the inside tends to be expressed. It is not usually a standard framing. It's usually beam with decking that runs across. You end up with beams every 4 feet as opposed to like a series of joists which you would see in a house that was built prior to that. These were built when wood was plentiful, so it was used. The decking was used as a way to economize at that time.
Ross, you have a question?
There's no major ranch style question.
It is part of that. Well, I could have used that. I would avoid the use of the word ranch, because I think that, to me, at any rate, connotes difference for the plan and the Eichler. Eichlers, this is a gross generalization because there are lots of exceptions. But I think some of the best examples of Eichlers tend to be squarish. They essentially are 9 grids. So the centers are carved out, and then the house occurs around them. Ranches aren't like that. Ranches are usually a string of, or again, gross generalization. It can be a string of rooms where circulation path is not always defined by a corridor. So one of the problems that you always run into with ranches, especially as young families are trying to figure out how to live in them, is that many of the rooms are really just glide hallways. And how you sort of manage that back into something that you can actually come to rest.
Let's go back in history to about, 1962, when the Oregon Expressway was put in. Can you describe that event and how it impacted this town?
Love to. This is actually a favorite topic of mine. And if I may, once again, just give a little run-up to this. Among the things that I have got myself involved with, for better or worse, in the city, is the Planning Commission. I was on the Planning Commission for 6 years, 2 years as chair, and that was now 8 years ago when I came off of it. But it seemed like many of the projects, especially the more controversial ones, that there were some ghosts that always seemed to come knocking with these projects. In that there tended to be a group of citizens that was suspicious about Stanford's intent and their commitment to the community. Now, I grew up in Chicago, and my father was, when I was very young, was at the University of Chicago. So, I was sort of familiar with large college towns. And the University of Chicago certainly had some issues with their neighborhood. The town gown dynamic is not something that's lost on me, but I certainly had no sense of the history there. The other thing that happened, the other ghost that always seemed to occur was a group of citizens that were very concerned about the lack of attention that was paid to South Palo Alto. And the sense that they had always sort of lost out. Where did this sense of lack of entitlement come from? And those were two things that were a thread through a lot of topics that came before the Planning Commission while I was there. I believe they structure a lot of the conversation in our community. So when I came off, I spent some money and hired some paralegals to do a little bit of research for me. And that's when I first, had always known that Oregon Expressway as something that had come, had been introduced to the community in the late 50s, and was finished in 62. And I never really realized or tied that event with some of these ghosts that we still deal with. So I have a hypothesis, which I've begun to write a paper, and I have written 2/3 of it before the Comprehensive Plan Committee started up, and so I've sort of put that to the side until I get done with the Comprehensive Plan Committee. Come on in. No worries, no worries.
Circus is coming to town.
So, but here's my hypothesis. And it's interesting. I have been interviewing a number of people who have been in the community a while, who were here living in the community in the late 50s and were here in 62. Unfortunately, that segment of our community is quickly depleting. So I've been taping these and getting them transcribed. But there is one woman who still lives over on Waverly, near Santa Rita, whose grandfather, I'm forgetting her name, was Mitchell, who Mitchell Park was named for, and was one of the longest running mayors of Palo Alto in the 20s, 30s, something like that. I'll have to go back to figure that out. In any case, she can remember her mother coming in, it must have been her father who was there, coming in and complaining to her father and saying, I hear there's been a turn Waverly into a 4-lane highway. And telling this to her husband and saying, well, what are you going to do about it? He said, well, why don't you do something about it? Why don't you get a few neighbors together and create a petition and take it to council? So what I did not know at that time was that among the proposals was to in fact turn what we now know as Oregon Expressway into a highway, a regular highway, have a sort of 85-like sort of highway going through there, and then there would be a couple of exits, one of which would come up and go down Waverly, which of course would transform what Waverly is, and they would need more space, so they were going to take away all that stuff. But that was one of the proposals. But why was anybody doing this in the first place? Why was this important? Well, Willow Road was part of it, but that was actually secondary. So let's take us back to 1945. The war ends. America's flooded with GIs like my father. Many of them who are going to get themselves educated in a GI Bill. At that time, Stanford was kind of an okay sort of regional school. I think maybe not more than maybe 5,000 students, something like that. But they had something that no other university in the country had: land. But they also had a problem that no other university had in the country, and that is that they couldn't sell out any of it. And there was, at that point, the president of the university went out to talk with a bunch of the different universities to figure out how they were dealing with this. Found one example, I believe it was in Colorado, where they were renting. He said, oh my gosh, we rent it now too, but it's all to people that are raising sheep or orchards and this and that, which makes no money. I rent it to somebody who's going to put a store on it or put an office place on it. I can rent it for a lot more. In case you missed the point, Palo Alto is all about taking advantage of land. The history is all about people looking to make money on land. Palo Alto owes its origin to the fact that when Stanford was building Stanford, he needed a place to put all the workers. So he created all the housing that was to the north of the university. And then he suggested to one of his friends, why don't you buy up the rest of the land and then you can parcel that off and sell that and make some money. And so we suddenly have the grid of Palo Alto. And that's back in 1910, or earlier. Jumping forward, I'm getting off topic. So Stanford goes and recognizes that it has both an opportunity and an obligation to create a lot more education. But they had no buildings, they had no professors, and they needed money to do this. So they come up with the concept, I'm compressing a lot here, of leasing the land, leasing part of it for a shopping center, and then leasing some more of it for office. And they had a remarkable and insightful epiphany someplace in there. And the president hired this guy named Terman, who had been working at MIT and was an expert, not only in radar, but he was an expert in getting grants from the military to fund his research. Now today, we would call these partnerships. Back then, the military, in order to advance its research, created special agreements with about 12 different universities around the country, of which MIT was one. And they put, I'm not kidding, trillions of dollars into the funding of these different research organizations, which are our universities today. So Caltech, Berkeley, University of North Dakota, you had Princeton, you had MIT, you had Harvard, Georgia Tech. All these very large technical institutes around the country, they became research centers for our country. Stanford was missing out. Hired Truman, changed that around. Truman said, "We've got the land. By the way, we're generating all these engineers. Let's keep them here because we can do a couple of things. They can lease the land, but we'll also ask them to enter into an agreement to have them educate all their employees by Stanford." So at lunchtime, they go to Stanford, they take their continuing education credits or get their degree, or they're going at night, etc. There's a tremendous, he was conceived of this tremendous sort of self-supporting environment, which was unique in the country. There was not another place that used the land this way, turned it into a office park. The concept of an office park really didn't exist prior to that. So, one more quick diversion here. Stanford had no money. So where are they going to get the money to do all this stuff? They need sewers, they need water, they need police, they need fire. They don't have the money to do all that stuff. They don't have the resources. However, there's a city over here that did have all of that stuff. And so Palo Alto entered into an agreement with Stanford where they would provide, we would extend the boundaries of the city into most of the properties, not all of it, but most of the properties that are getting, that needed this infrastructure was going to become part of the city. So Stanford pays the city taxes on that. And the city then provides the infrastructure. That produced a tremendous amount of cash, literally within a year's time in Palo Alto. And then suddenly Palo Alto starts building pre-salt City Hall, pre-salt sewage plant, creates community centers, until later in the 70s, when the state made it illegal to use money that comes out of the utilities for anything but supporting the utility infrastructure. So that comes into all of that. Okay, so now Stanford has created a shopping center and a whole bunch of issues there. They've created an office park. So we're now in the 62. In 62, the Bayland Highway had just turned into 101. The only other way to get to the office park was by this other street called El Camino, because 280 wasn't finished by that time. It wasn't finished until the 70s. So how do you get people to the office park? Because suddenly nobody could move on El Camino. All this traffic on 101. And people were on 101 were coming up they were coming up in Barco, coming down California, jogging around Jordan, which had been built that time, and then going straight over the tracks to the North California, what we think of as the North California Business District. There was no underpass. So you did a circuitous movement through the city to get to the office park. That's not helping Stanford at all. They've got employees, by the hundreds that need to get out there. So what do? They start looking at different ways to get from 101 over there. And the first objective was to get them through California, get them through Palo Alto. Willow came later. So that was the big motivator, how to get employees, materials, and everything. And that's why Oregon Expressway was conceived of, and why we end up in the dilemma that we have now. Because Stanford at that time, I want to put quite these terms, but they essentially owned the city council. Most of the city council members were either leasing space in the office park, so we're very conscious of what's going on here. They had a very aggressive president and provost and VP of real estate. So between Stanford's interest to get this through and between their sort of lock on the council, they felt, mind you, pretty entitled because they had just won the war. And And this isn't unique to Palo Alto. The city of Chicago also had issues with the University of Chicago as well, which had some similarities in there. But let's, forgive me, all of us older white men. There were a lot of older white men that felt like they knew best for what the community was. And regardless of what, if there was some pain that had to be shouldered by the community, okay, because we're doing this for the betterment of everyone.
After all, Hewlett Packard and Varian was out there establishing itself straight from scratch.
Yeah, well, and they were doing good in other ways. And I don't mean to lessen their impacts. But here's the thing. When some housewife submits a petition to the city council and says, what are you doing? The city council said, thank you very much, next. So the impact on our community, I think, was several-fold. First of all, if you are going to enlarge Oregon Avenue, which is a little two-lane street, and make it wider, you would think, perhaps, that you would draw a line down the middle of it and expand it both ways equally. Makes sense, right? Easy to do. Add a lane on one side, add a lane on the other side. However, Palo Alto, as a result of some 30-some-odd land acquisitions over the course of its history, and the lands that are to the south of Oregon Avenue had only been added about 5 years earlier. Where do you think most of the voting public of Palo Alto lived? They lived on the north side, not the south side. So when Oregon Expressway was enlarged, it was enlarged to the south, which necessitated taking out some 90-some-odd houses, some of which were moved, some of which were destroyed, many of the homeowners sued the city because they felt they were not being compensated appropriately. But the reality was is that the south side lost. They didn't get the consideration of the north side. So in my mind, that was the catalyst. The other thing is that the institutions that had served the community for so very long were suddenly seen as not really supporting the interests of the community, and that was Stanford and the city council. And this was also the moment that gave rise to neighborhood organizations and the mission that the neighborhood organizations, even to today, really believe that they have, which is oversight of the community council and Stanford. So that's why I think the Oregon Expressway was so important and the impact of that in our community, which we live with today.
Okay, last subject before we open it more. The Citizens Advisory Committee, of which you are co-chair. What's its mission? What has it done? What's good and what's bad?
Okay. Yeah.
More than one sentence.
Yeah, thank you. So the mission, as myself and my co-chair, Arthur Keller, understand it, of the committee is to collect all of the issues and concerns that the council should be weighing as it decides what the comp plan should be. Along the way, if there's opportunities for consensus around some topics, to record those and bring those back to the council as well. I will be quick to add, I will be quick to add that the comp plan, or the Citizens Committee, is only one of several sort of voices that are weighing in on this. The Planning Commission obviously has a significant voice. There have also been other workshops. This has been in the works since I've been on the comp plan, so 2004, 2003. It's just taken a very long time. So that's the basic mission. Find consensus where we can, where we can't, to make sure all the issues are well documented so that the council can resolve them.
Do they make recommendations?
Not really. It assembles this information. It is advisory.
The reason, I believe, that the committee was created was because the council did not feel that the various voices in the community were well represented. And so it was looking to create a fairly large group. It started out as 21 people, I believe, with a couple of non-voting members in it. Recognizing that there would be a wide series of views on the various issues. For both Arthur Keller and myself, one of our personal goals was to create an environment where people could talk about this stuff, where we try and focus on issues and not positions. I'd like to think that in large part we were successful in that. We will have our last meeting in 2 weeks, and I will ask our assembled group how successful we were in that. This assembled information and the consensus is where we've been able to find it. The comp plan, ultimately, when it is takes its final steps through the council, will be evolutionary. It will not be revolutionary. As I mentioned earlier, the forces that are going to be playing out in Palo Alto and the rest of the peninsula are very large. I doubt highly it will be 10 years before portions of the comp plan will be revisited in probably some detail, just because things are going to happen too quickly. I think the council's aware of that. I think members of our committee and others are aware of that. So I think it operates, what it does do is it gives us a way to talk about how to manage through these issues. It gives us a framework for what some of the values are in the community, as well as a technical framework about how to break issues apart and deal with them. I don't know, Ellen, how am I doing? Is that okay? I'm getting a headphone from Ellen back there who's on the committee. Does that begin to help answer some of that?
Yeah, what issues do you foresee presenting to the council as part of your wrap-up?
Well, some of the issues that they need to resolve include the most controversial ones, which is where new density is going to be in the city. I think there's some consensus to try and keep it away from San Antonio, to look to try and add it, at transportation nodes where it has to happen. The other issue that arises its head, which is really important here in all of this, is housing. But the issue of housing quickly gets into social equity. It is among the most sensitive for those that have it, the most important for those that don't. And because there is no new land, the prices, the cost for building for what it's valued at escalates, which quickly prices out younger families, which quickly prices out those that do not have the wherewithal to do that. So the issues of social equity are very, very important. We're trying to convince people that they need to think of their downtown differently or their neighborhoods differently is very, very difficult. And again, this is not limited to Palo Alto. It's an issue throughout the Bay Area. But it will become more and more acute as time goes on. There are some hopefully technical opportunities that all these cities may take advantage of in the future: autonomous cars, better synchronization of parking, and all those sorts of things. And the likelihood is we'll see a lot of that because there's going to be a tremendous pressure to find ways to manage this stuff. But it will become more and more acute. There's frankly no way around that.
Daniel, thank you very much. Any questions you can ask generally or privately, I'm sure.
Yes, please.
What about the complicated?
Hang on.
Oh, I was going to turn that off later, if so, is there anything we should know?
so I have no idea.
Oh,
I don't know what you're going to ask.
no. I was going to, that was an open-ended question.
No.
So, what do you see specifically as the political, the biggest political on here or what?
Regarding the comp plan.
Yeah.
The question was, what do I see are the biggest political hurdles that the council will have to overcome to get that done?
Well, perhaps each other, but I haven't been to any of their meetings.
You know, let me maybe characterize this in a slightly different way. Part of the reason that we have a co-chair, Arthur and I, is because for reasons which I frankly think are erroneous, people associate me with, a sort of more development-friendly environment or world or whatever. And Arthur is identified with no or slow growth. It's an amusing secret for Arthur and I, because on most, when we were on the planning commission together, the amount of times we voted differently, very few. We actually think very similarly about a lot of these issues. Certainly we come at them from different places. I have not worked for a developer, 25 years. The work that we do for some large landowners. We don't do any houses that are developer houses. My issues, frankly, are much more focused on the homeowner and what's the impacts of the city are to protect that homeowner. The reason I mention all of this is because the differences between a lot of the issues, I think are a lot less than people think. They're very helpful for generating votes. They're very helpful for creating differences or to highlight differences. But I don't think there's anybody that's interested in building, a 50-story high-rise in University Avenue. If there was one, there isn't today. I don't think there's anybody that wants, semi-trucks running through neighborhoods. There are some people that want no growth, and there are some people that think that there should be no limits, and we should create all the houses we possibly can. I don't think that's the majority. I think the real problems are environmental and structural. When I say environmental, I'm talking about the fact that we have a lot more people to deal with, and that we are not an island. As I said before, we could do nothing, but the neighbors on either side of us are going to be doing a lot. We're going to be having to deal with their impacts. I don't know if I'm quite getting at much, but I think the underlying issue here is finding ways for the community to talk to each other. I think there are 21 people in that room when we started that had some pretty significant perceived differences. And I think that's ameliorated dramatically over the last 18 months. There still are differences. Sometimes some highly vocal differences. But we were able to, it took a while, to get through a lot of the land use and the transportation issues and find ways of seeing the issues in similar ways. Yeah.
Stanford deals almost as much with the county, I think, and the planning and oversight agency of the city.
With the government, yeah.
And with the government use plan and so on. Would you comment on sort of the synchronization or consensus or agreement between the council, city council on one hand, and then the county? Is there a way to...
Yeah, I'm probably not, I don't have a lot of insight into that. There are issues, there's constant communication, both formally and informally. Liz Niss is a particularly valuable resource to the community because of her relationship with the county, having been there. We have other resources, of course, there as well. But as you know, the county years ago, with the support of Palo Alto, created significant conditions under which Stanford was allowed to grow, having to do with trips and the amount of area that they could build, etc. And Stanford is, as a result, has the largest transportation fleet of any college in the country. It is incredibly well managed. People come from all over the world to figure out how they do that. It's a little focused, Again, there's this, it's not like they're going to go out of their way to help the rest of the community. But they do a lot more for us than I think most people realize. They alleviate a lot more traffic than people realize. And there's lots of opportunities for synchronization there. All of the coordination between not just the city and the county, but the city and its neighbors, the various environmental organizations, all of that coordination is going to become ever more important every year that goes by because of all the pressure and the use of the land. It's just all can become a lot more acute and even more complex.
One other question. Did the goats you talk about that affected the Oregon staff?
Where it was created or killed, went forward, or I'm not sure.
Did that have a significant overshadowing of the decision on the San Diego Road and Palo Alto's decision to not allow that to, the Andrews and El Camino?
Oh, I think absolutely. There are pros and cons to that. I mean, Stanford, when they realized the troubles they were having with Palo Alto, then went to Willow, but by that time Willow had recognized what Palo Alto did and was far more successful in happening. Downside is that you end up with, frankly, no arteries, with the exception of coming down 280, that get you to the Stanford properties. So in some ways, we've shot ourselves in the foot because how do you get all that traffic from one place to the other? There are no clean answers.
Originally, Stanford built the shopping center to make money, but it was not supposed to be a regional shopping center. It was supposed to be helping the local people. And so there was not going to be a need for all these big highways coming to Stanford Shopping Center. And they screwed Palo Alto. Palo Alto then became a nothing town as far as shopping was concerned. And they couldn't go Willow because Menlo Park refused to be part of that. That was before the Oregon Expressway was established. Willow Road was not going to be a through street.
Yeah, the Stanford Shopping Center opened in 54 or something like that. Yeah.
So much history involved in that whole procedure.
Yeah.
It is difficult. But the point is, we weren't supposed to be a regional shopping center. We were supposed to be a city next to Stanford. It was just going to remain a city next to Stanford. And unfortunately, all this development has created a whole different world.
I think that was nearsighted. People just couldn't imagine that creating, it's a supply side issue. In real estate theory, it's called gravity theory. In the sense that a single gas station that doesn't make money will make more money if there's another gas station across the street. It'll make even more money if there's a third one there. That was a theory that was actually developed in the 20s by an economist that was hired by a city like Austin, Texas or something like that. And said, why can't we attract anybody to come to a city? And so he studied, he compared, I think it was Austin, I can't remember exactly, I think it was compared Austin to like LA. And he said, I can't explain why, but the reality is that if you have more people in the place, it's going to attract more people. And so nobody felt that okay, we're going to put a lot of retail all together here, that suddenly it's going to want a lot more retail than it has, a very impactful business. Nobody sort of recognized that.
And then they started advertising regionally, of course.
Well, what else was here? Yeah, I mean,
In order to draw more people.
Yeah.
I mean, those of us who've been around and have been seeing this happen.
Yeah.
Craig?
It's devastating.
Craig has a question.
Sure.
Yeah.
I was sort of a multi-part question. The San Francisco Creek project is extended into 4 years and maybe looking at a 5th year. Mission Park Library went 4 years in overtime. Why doesn't matter? The proposal to put a bullet train through town could go easily 8 to 10 years over the expected time of construction. Whether that's undergrounded or aerial, my question is where can it physically be put? Does that mean shutting down Alma Street and taking that artery out of service for the duration of the project? Or are they going to shut down the Caltrain right-of-way and repurpose it for the future? I'm wondering what are the realistic probabilities?
So we used to say on the planning commission that when you're talking about like the BRT, the bus rapid transit concept, that's something that could occur, 3 to 5 years. When you're talking about the bullet train, you're talking about something that could occur in 10 to 15 years. When you're talking about, when you're talking about the electrification of Caltrain, that's a 10 to 15 year horizon line. When you're talking about creating a bullet train, that's probably a 20 to 30 year horizon line. And I am not an expert at this at all. So to answer your question accurately, I couldn't even begin it, but here's some of the things that constrain that. Caltrain owns right-of-way. That right-of-way does not extend into Alma Street, so they wouldn't be able to take it unless the city would give it to them, which I doubt would ever happen.
Because the state is by eminent domain, they would...
I think that would probably add 10 or 15 more years in courts to deal with that. Again, I am not an expert here. I don't know what I'm talking about, but you asked.
Yeah.
So very likely, the easiest, like anything, the easiest route is the one that's going to be taken. And the easiest thing to have to do is to put it on the ground without undergrounding or anything, and then do that. That'll never happen because all the community, there's no way they would be able to get that past any community. I know that there have been studies that have looked at the opportunity of undergrounding. They would have to find a way, I can't believe they would ever shut down the entire rail, so they have to find a way to create some temporary tracks, some siding, to keep the business going and digging underneath. Doing a completely covered, a hole in the ground like the Boston Tunnel is extremely expensive. It's something like $1 billion a mile or something. It's just very expensive. Doing it covered is still extremely expensive, where you have it covered and or open a trench, basically. And you're very limited because unfortunately Palo Alto has San Mosquito Creek, which is 22 feet underneath the surface of the creek. And trying to get the train down there, because trains, unlike cars, are not allowed to have, they're dramatically less steep, the slopes that they're allowed to go down. So you have to start miles and miles away to really get to that level. I understand that there have been studies that have looked at, if it comes over San Mosquito Creek, it wouldn't be able to get low enough to be underneath University Avenue, but my memory is correct, there's enough slope to be able to get it underneath Churchill from that point going south. But we're a long way away from that.
I think San Mateo was able to run an aerial into a grade separation.
Yeah, that is a far less expensive way of dealing with it. Of course, then you're dealing with this new eyesore, which I grew up with in Chicago. Sorry. I don't think that's anyone's first preference.
Right.
frankly, if you think out 50 or 60 years or something, and not having a train along that edge, and that turns into a park that connects San Jose to San Francisco, with the opportunity for things of that sort, I mean, that's a pretty wonderful scenario, but probably not in our lifetime, or at least mine.
We're obliged to empty this room by 1, and I think this is the first time I've heard someone comment negatively against L in Chicago.
I didn't say it was negative, I just said I had to deal with it, George.
Okay. Thank you very much.
It took me to work.